This is the complete the square homework solution set. Now notice we're given a quadratic. We're going to review a bit here from what we talked about in class. Ax squared plus bx plus c. We have a nice quadratic. Now we're going to look at this bx term here. In other words, we need the value for b. And the value for b here is 6. So we're going to take that 6 and we're going to divide by 2. So 6 divided by 2, and this is our first step, is the value 3. And then the second step is to square this value. So we get 3 squared, which is 9. And this is my second step here in completing the square. So what I'm going to do here now is let's notate that I'm going to use this value 3 eventually, but I'm going to first use this b half squared term. I'm going to use the value 9. And here's how we use this. Okay, we know already that y is x squared plus 6x. This is where the 9 comes in. I'm going to add 9. And I'm going to subtract 9. And that value again is really 0. Don't forget we have a 4 out here. So we preserve our equality because, again, 9 over 9 here, if we want to look at this portion, is the value 0. And so you know that if I add nothing to my equation, it doesn't change the equation. So this is the portion that we're going to use here for completing the square. Okay? Now, let's get rid of some of this. We know this is 0. Okay, this is 0. And what I want to point out to people is to focus on this trinomial here. We have a perfect square trinomial. I'm going to focus on this trinomial, the first 3 terms. And it is important to write it as plus 9 minus 9, do the addition first. So this trinomial here is going to become, when we factor, x something squared here for those 3 terms. This is where the blue term comes in, right here. This number is positive 3. Now notice what happens here. If I replace that, or if I use that value here in my parentheses and I use FOIL, I get x squared plus 6x plus 9. So this is what I mean by we're going to use this value. We're always going to use that value in completing the square. And the very last step now for us to be would be just simply perform the arithmetic with this minus 9 and this plus 4. So here's where I do my arithmetic. And to summarize again, just so you guys know, factor here, it's a perfect square trinomial, and simply do the arithmetic over here, do the add. So negative 9 plus 4 gives us actually negative 5. This is our final answer, that y is x plus 3 squared minus 5. We have completed the square. And that's what we have to do with these first problem sets. Let's go to number 3. We have y equals x squared minus 4x plus 1. Again, we're going to focus on this term here. Our b term is negative 4. Right? This is my b term. This is the bx term in the quadratic equation. And b now is negative 4. So we have to take b divided by 2, which is negative 4 divided by 2, which is negative 2. And then we square this number. Negative 2 squared is 4. We're going to use the negative 2 eventually. And we're going to start by using the positive 4. So here we go. Y is x squared minus 4x. Now we're going to use that number. We're going to add 4 we're going to subtract 4. Don't forget what's already there. We have this addition of 1. So to summarize again, I'm going to say to you, we have a perfect square trinomial here. We're going to factor these first 3 terms. And then finally, we're just going to do some arithmetic with the last 2. So here's what you get. Y equals, when I factor perfect square trinomial, notice again what I have here. This number here is negative 2. I'm going to put this negative 2 here, and I'm going to square everything. So I'm going to square this difference. I'm going to add negative 4 plus 1, and I get negative 3. And ladies and gentlemen, what you see here is your quadratic equation in a different form. We have completed the square. And that's number 3. Number 5. Y equals x squared plus 8x minus my 3. Okay. Again, we're going to focus on this b value. Okay. I know I have a bx term. Here my b is 8, so I'm going to take b and divide by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. I'm going to square this, and 4 squared, we know, is 16. I'm going to use this positive 4 eventually, but immediately I'm going to use the positive 16. Okay, here we go. Y equals, just write down the terms again, x squared plus 8x, those first 2 terms. And then we're going to add the 16, and we're going to subtract the 16, because that's really 0. And then don't forget there's really a negative 3 out here. The first 3 terms here, we factor a perfect square trinomial. The last 2 terms, we simply perform the arithmetic. So when we factor, we get y equals x something squared. Negative 16 minus 3 is negative 19. Don't forget, positive 4 is used here. This is plus 4. And we're done. So if we want, we could just simply write it this way. Okay, we've completed the square. Let's see what number 7 looks like. Y equals x squared minus 2x plus 5. Notice again, negative 2 is my b value. So if you like, we'll just cut to the chase and say, okay, that b, we divide by 2. Negative 2 over 2 is negative 1. Square this. Negative 1 squared is positive 1. We're going to use negative 1 eventually, and immediately we use the positive 1. Okay. So here we go. Y is x squared minus 2x. We write down the first 2 terms, and then we use that positive 1 and subtract it. That's really 0 again. But don't forget, we already had a positive 5 here. So for the first 3 terms again, these 3 terms, a perfect square trinomial, we factor. The last 2 we simply add. We get y equals something squared plus 4. So we have the x. This is where, again, we use the negative 1. So I can put here negative 1, and I'm done. And that's number 7. Number 9. y equals x squared plus 10x minus 3. Again, use this b value of 10. So I'm going to write that here. B over 2 is 10 over 2. We know that is 5. We square that. 5 squared we know is 25. Okay. We're going to use the 5 eventually. We use the 25 immediately. So y is x squared plus 10x. Write down the first two terms. We're going to add 25. We're going to subtract 25. That's really the number 0. And don't forget we have that minus 3. So now y becomes, we get a perfect square trinomial. Don't forget. These three terms we factor. These last two terms we perform arithmetic. So I have x here, and negative 25 minus 3 is negative 28. And don't forget, we have a positive 5 here. So this is where my plus 5 goes. We have completed the square. And this is number 9. Let's look for number 11. We have y equals x squared minus 12x minus 8. My b value is negative 12. So b divided by 2 is negative 12 divided by 2, negative 6. b over 2 squared is negative 6 squared, or positive 36. We're going to use the negative 6 eventually, but we're going to start with using the 36. Y equals x squared minus 12x. Those are my first two terms. And again, I'm going to add 36, subtract 36, and ultimately here I'm going to subtract 8. So that y is going to be, if we factor the first three terms, factor the first three, do arithmetic in the last two. X squared minus 36, negative 36 minus 8 is negative 44. So we have x, and don't forget to use this minus 6. Okay, because we're going to use that value. And you're done. You've completed the square. Let's look for number 13. 2x squared plus 4x minus 1. Y equals 2x squared plus 4x minus 1. Now you're going to notice something here. Let me point this out to you. We have an a value here that's positive 2. Now, the process, if you recall from lecture, is a little bit different when you have that positive 2 there. So there's a couple of ways of going about this for completing the square. One approach actually is an interesting approach where people actually say, hey, start off by dividing, both sides by that value for a. And you'll get y over 2. You get that 2x squared over 2 plus 4x over 2 minus 1. Or you get y over 2 is going to be x squared plus 2x minus 1/2. And what they would like you to do now in this problem is simply to complete the square now for the variables that you see here. And I'm going to use a different color. I'm going to say here now, complete the square here for, you got this. Now we have a b value is what I'm saying. So let's change that. recall from lecture that now my b value here is positive 2. And so I can say that b over 2, which is 2 over 2, we know as 1. And then b over 2 squared is 1 squared, which is actually 1. So we can complete the square because now here that a value in front is the number 1. And we're back to completing the square the way we did in the first, problem sets. So, like we did before, eventually we're going to use this positive 1. Okay, let's go back. And we're going to use this positive 1. It's the same number, but we're going to use that value immediately. Here's how we do this. Don't forget we have y over 2 now. We divided both sides by 2. It's x squared plus 2x. We're going to use that red 1. We're going to add 1. We're going to subtract 1. And then don't forget we have that minus 1/2 here. So now again you get to handle this perfect square trinomial. We get to factor this. And over here we get to do the arithmetic. So when we factor, you get y over 2 becomes something squared. Now, -1 minus 1/2 we know is -3/2. X, now this is where we're going to use this 1 again, just like before. So we're going to add our 1. And we've completed the square, sort of. I mean, we have completed the square, but we have y over 2 on the left. So how we handle this now would be simply to do the following. You're going to have to solve for y, which means you're going to multiply 2 to both sides. And do some arithmetic. On the left side, my 2's go away. So we now get the value y here. And that's 2 times x plus 1 squared minus 2 over 2 cancels, and that's minus 3. You have now completed the square when you started off with this first term here. The value for a is the number 2. So what you do is simply divide both sides by the value for a, in this case, which is 2, and then you complete the square because you now have your x squared plus 2x. In other words, you now get this portion over here. Anyway, very colorful. This is how we go about it. So let's try number 15. And let's see if we can minimize all the colors, because that's really making me dizzy too. So now this one we have is y equals 3x squared minus 24x plus 49. Notice we're going to have to divide both sides by 3 to make that 1. So we're going to do that. Divide by 3. We get y over 3 is 3x squared over 3 minus 24x over 3 plus 49 thirds. 3's cancel, and I get y over 3 is x squared minus 24 divided by 3 is 8. So we got minus 8x plus 49 thirds. Let's complete the square now. Here's my b value. It's -8. So -8, let's write it all down. b over 2, -8 over 2, which is -4. b over 2 squared is -4 squared, which is positive 16. We're going to use this number immediately. So let's kind of minimize the colors. We have y over 3 is x minus 4 squared. Remember this? That's the value we put in our parentheses because we're going to factor. Uh-oh. Hold on. Back up. Let's be complete. Let's do everything the way we've been doing it. Rewrite this. We got y over 3. X squared minus 8x, Caught that. Plus 16. And we're going to have to put this lower since we're running out of space here. Caught that error. Y over 3. X squared minus 8x. Here we go. Plus 16 minus 16. And then don't forget we had a plus 49 thirds. Factor the first three terms. We get y over 3 becomes x minus 4 squared. And then I have this minus 16 plus 49 thirds. Now let's kind of talk about this arithmetic. This is intermediate algebra. So let's remember some tricks here. Since this denominator over here is 3, right? What we'll do is multiply this number by 3 and divide by 3. That's really the number 1. The reason we do this is so we have the same denominator so we can add our fractions. So when we do this arithmetic now, y over 3 is x minus 4 squared minus 48 over 3 plus 49 over 3. And do your arithmetic, and notice you get plus 1/3. And like you did before, we're going to have to multiply both sides by my 3 because you're going to solve for y. And in the end, these 3's cancel. You get y is 3 times x minus 4 squared plus 1. We've completed the square. Let's see what the next problem is. Number 17, we have the following. Y is negative x squared minus 2x plus 2. And we're going to use the same strategy because in this case here, we have negative 1. That's our a value. So we're going to divide both sides by that negative 1. Okay. We get y over negative 1 becomes negative x squared over negative 1 minus 2x over that negative 1 plus 2 over negative 1. And so we can keep this, if you'd like, as y over negative 1, and then we get our x squared, we get plus 2x, we get minus 2, just by doing arithmetic. Notice again, we have this b value, and my b value is positive 2. So b over 2 is 2 over 2, better known as 1. And then b over 2 squared is actually 1 squared, also known as 1. So again, we're going to use this one immediately. And let's write down the terms. Y over negative 1 becomes x squared plus 2x plus 1 minus 1. And don't forget, we had already a negative 2 here. So again, just like before, factor the first 3 terms, do arithmetic on the last 2 terms. Here's what this looks like. Y over negative 1 is x, and it's going to be plus my 1 minus 3. Now, this is y over negative 1. So, as we did before, we're going to now have to multiply by negative 1 to both sides, which means multiplying the right side by negative 1 every term. And you get cancellation. You simply get y is negative x plus 1 squared plus 3. And we've completed the square. So that's how you handle a negative. Now, number 19, very similar. Get y is negative x squared minus 6x minus 5. Notice again, we start with that negative 1 there. So we're going to have to divide both sides by negative 1. y over negative 1, negative x squared over negative 1, minus 6x over negative 1, minus 5 over negative 1. Y over negative 1 is x squared plus 6x plus our 5. Okay? So, and we can also even replace y over negative 1 simply by negative y, and that's fine too. As long as you know that negative y is not y, we're now going to complete the square here. We see the value 6 for b. So, we have b over 2, which is 6 over 2, which is 3. b over 2 squared is 3 squared, better known as the number 9. Here we go, positive 9, and that's what we're going to use immediately. So we have x squared plus 6x plus 9 minus 9 plus our 5. We get negative y is x squared. Well, let's go through the process. Let me remind you, perfect square trinomial, we factor, and then we have some arithmetic to perform. So we get x plus 3 squared minus 4. Multiply both sides now by negative 1 to solve for y. Y is negative x plus 3 squared plus 4. Similar to the last one. And now we have number 21. 21 says y is negative 2x squared minus 4x plus 2. A here is negative 2. Divide both sides now by negative 2. Y over negative 2, negative 2x squared over negative 2, minus 4x over negative 2, plus 2 over negative 2. X squared plus 2x minus 1. We can now complete the square with our b value being positive 2. So b over 2 gives us 2 over 2, better known as 1. b over 2 squared is 1 squared, better known as 1. We're going to use that value immediately. So we get y over negative 2 becomes x squared plus, well, let's write this lower. Y over negative 2 is x squared plus 2x plus 1 minus 1. And don't forget, we already had a negative 1 here. So like before, factor your perfect square trinomial for the first 3 terms, and then finally add your last 2 terms. Y over negative 2 is x plus 1 squared minus 2. What you're going to do now is you're going to multiply both sides by negative 2, because you have to solve for y. So negative 2, negative 2, negative 2. See what we end up with? We get y, because these negative 2's cancel, is negative 2 times x plus 1 squared plus your 4. And that's number 21. So number 23, we have y equals negative 3x squared minus 16x plus 3. your a value is negative 3 again. So you have to divide both sides by that number, negative 3. And we end up with the following. Y over negative 3 is negative 3x squared over negative 3 minus 16x over negative 3 plus 3 over negative 3. And actually, let's go back here. Number 23, there's a typo. It looks like that's supposed to be negative 12x, so I'm sorry. Okay. Still with the typo, number 23. Okay, we're good now. So y equals negative 3. It's going to be x squared plus 4x minus 1. X squared plus 4x minus 1. Okay, we can complete the square now. Notice our value for b here is 4. So b over 2 is 4 over 2, which is 2. b over 2 squared is 2 squared, which is 4. We're going to use this 4 immediately. And this is what it looks like. Y over negative 3 is x squared plus 4x. Now remember, add 4, subtract 4, plus 2. Y over negative 3 is x squared. Well, not yet. Let's remember. Factor the first 3 terms and use arithmetic on the last 2 terms. So we get x plus 2 squared minus 2. Now solve for y. Multiply both sides by negative 3. Get cancellation, and you get y equal to negative 3 x plus 2 squared plus my 6. And you're done. So as you can see, the first set here of problems were designed for us to go through the complete the square process. Number 25. We have x squared here plus 6x plus 4 is 0. And for these problems here, they want us to solve. And you're solving these for x, and you solve these equations. It's a quadratic. And they want us to solve by completing the square. So let's go over the process again as we discussed in class. In this case, b here is actually 6. So, okay, b over 2. 6 over 2 is the value 3. And the b over 2 squared is 3 squared, better known as 9. And we're going to use this immediately just like before. This 9. So we're going to go through our process. But it's slightly different because on one hand you have no longer the letter y, you have 0 on that side. And here we have plus 4 is 0. First 3 terms we factor. The last 2 we perform arithmetic. I have x plus 3 again squared. Don't forget, we're using that value. That goes here. And my arithmetic tells me that negative 9 plus 4 is negative 5. And now this equals 0. It's no longer y. So what you're going to use now here is we're going to use what we call the, if you remember, the square root principle, or the square root formula. And we're going to use the general case of that. So if you remember from past homework or past videos or whatever, if something squared is some number, then what we can say is the following. Let's write it down here. Then what we can say here is that thing is plus or minus the square root of n. And n is any number. This is called the square root formula. And this is what we're going to use here to solve these equations for x, because for these problems, they want us to solve for x. And that's what we're going to do. Okay, let's try this out. So I can't use the square root formula yet because I have this minus 5 here. So we're going to have to add 5 to both sides. And if we do, notice we get x minus 3 squared is 5, which means x minus 3 is plus or minus the square root of 5. And now we're able to solve for x, get x by itself by adding 3 to both sides. And notice what you have here. You have x is 3 plus or minus the square root of 5. And as a solution set, you can see this as the following. 3 plus the square root of 5 and 3 minus the square root of 5. So here is our answer. And notice that square root of 5 here can't be simplified. So this is how we solve equations using the square root, or I'm sorry, solve equations by not just using that square root formula, but by using completing the square. And so let's see how number 27 looks. We get x squared minus 4x plus 1 is 0. Okay. Using the same process, b is negative 4. I'm going to actually do this a little bit more efficiently. Okay. So notice I'm just doing the same exact thing I did before. We got x squared minus 4x. We're going to add 4. We're going to subtract 4. Plus 1 is 0. First 3 terms, I factor. This is x minus 2 squared. Last 2 terms I add. So let me remind you. Factor the first 3 terms. Add the last 2. And this equals 0. We're going to add 3 to both sides because we're going to use the square root formula. You get x minus 2 squared is positive 3. So that means x minus 2 is plus or minus the square root of 3. Notice that radical can't be simplified. We're going to add 2 to both sides, and we end up with x being 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. So final answer in solution set form is 2 plus the square root of 3 and 2 minus the square root of 3. And we solved this equation by completing the square. Now let's look at number 29. X squared plus 8x minus 3 is 0. My b is positive 8. 8 over 2, which is 4. 4 squared is 16. Use this. X squared. X squared plus 8x plus 16 minus 16 minus 3 is 0. Factor, perfect square trinomial, and we add. x plus 4 squared minus 19 is 0. And add your 19 to both sides. We end up with x plus 4 squared is 19. X plus 4 will be plus or minus square root of 19. Subtract my 4. X is negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 19. Solution set looks like this. Negative 4 plus the square root of 19 and negative 4 minus the square root of 19. And that's how we solve this equation, by completing the square. And let's go down to, it looks like number 31. X squared minus 2x plus 5 is 0. My b value is negative 2. Negative 2 over 2 is negative 1, and negative 1 squared is positive 1. We're going to use the positive 1 immediately. Okay. X squared minus 2x plus 1 minus 1 plus 5 is 0. Factor the first three terms. Perform arithmetic on the last two. X minus 1 squared plus 4 is 0. We're going to subtract 4 from both sides, and we'll end up here with x minus 1 squared is negative 4. The square root formula says x minus 1 will be plus or minus square root of negative 4. And if you guys recall, the square root of negative 4 here, this is actually 2i. We're going to replace that with 2i. Okay? Square root of negative 4 is 2i. So I get x minus 1 is plus or minus 2i. I'm almost done solving for x. You're going to add 1 to both sides. X is 1 plus or minus 2i. Here's my solution. In set notation, I get 1 plus 2i, and I get 1 minus 2i. So you notice here, I want to point out too, these are of the form, well, these are complex solutions. And complex solutions are non-real numbers. These are complex numbers. They're the form a plus bi, if you guys recall that. And in this example, we got simply complex answers or complex numbers as a solution for x. And these are non-real numbers. So that was number 31. We now have to look at number 33. And this is x squared plus 10x minus 3 is 0. B is 10. 10 over 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. We use this value. X squared plus 10x plus 25 minus 25 minus 3 is 0. Factor the first three terms here. Seem to have that problem today. And I get x plus 5 squared minus 28 equals 0. So we can now add 28 to both sides. And you end up with x plus 5 squared is 28. Use the square root formula. X plus 5 will be plus or minus square root of 28. Now, when I simplify this radical here, this becomes, if you remember, square root of 4 times 7, square root of 4, square root of 7, 2 square root of 7. X plus 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 7. Subtract my 5. X is negative 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 7. And solution set says negative 5 plus 2 square root of 7, negative 5 minus 2 square root of 7. And these are not complex. These are real solutions. Happen to be irrational because you have an irrational number. And that was number 33. So now we're on 35. Okay. So number 35. X squared minus 12x minus 8 is 0. B is negative 12. Negative 12 over 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 squared is positive 36. Use that 36. X squared minus 12x plus 36 minus 36 minus that 8 is 0. Factor the first three terms. We get x minus 6 squared. Add the last two. That looks like it's a minus 44 is 0. That's what it looks like. Yes. Okay. Add your 44 to both sides. And you end up with x minus 6 is positive 44. Square root formula. X minus 6 is plus or minus square root of 44. Now we're going to have to simplify this radical here. Okay? Remember, this is 4 times 11, the square root of 4 times square root of 11, or 2 times square root of 11. X minus 6 becomes plus or minus 2 times the square root of 11. Add my 6 to both sides. I'm going to end up with x equals 6 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 11. And solution set, 6 plus 2 times the square root of 11, 6 minus 2 times the square root of 11. And you are done here, and that was number 35, I believe. Leads us to 37. So 37. 2x squared plus 4x minus 1 is 0. Now we're going to go with the same approach here. Notice again, this starts off with my a value not being 1, it's actually 2. So we're going to divide both sides here by 2. And that gives us 2x squared divided by 2 plus 4x divided by 2 minus 1/2, and 0 divided by 2 is actually 0. We get x squared plus 2x minus 1/2 is 0. My b value is positive 1, so, or positive 2, sorry. So we're going to take that positive 2 and divide by 2, which is 1. I'm going to square that 1 and get another 1. We use this 1 immediately. X squared plus 2x. You're going to add that 1, and you're going to subtract that 1. And don't forget you have a minus 1/2 here, and that equals 0. Okay. Now, let's go through every step here. Factor the first 3 terms and add the last 2 terms, and we get x plus 1 squared minus 3/2 is 0. So we're going to now add our 3/2 to both sides here, if you guys remember, and you get x plus 1 squared is 3/2. That means x plus 1 is plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. Here's a radical we have to handle. We have to rationalize the denominator because the square root of a quotient is quotient of square roots. We get the square root of 6 over 2. We rationalize this denominator. So x plus 1 is the square root of 6 over 2. You subtract 1 from both sides. Oh, we forgot our plus or minus. Let's go back. Okay. Yeah. Subtract our 1, and here's what we get. Okay. X is negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 6 over 2. And we are done as an answer. Solution set will look like this. Negative 1 plus the square root of 6 over 2. Negative 1 minus the square root of 6 over 2. And that's how we handle, I guess, when you have this a value. So it leaves us to 39. 39. (3x squared) minus 24x plus 49 is 0. Now, if we're smart, that looks a lot like, let's put this in red, C 15. We did this already. 3x squared minus 24x plus 49, number 15. So I'm going to have to go back all the way there to 15. Let's see if we remember what 15 is. Okay. Boy, it's really far away. 21. Okay, number 15 we have here. We did this. We get 3 times x minus 4 squared plus 1. Now that equals y. But in this case, y is 0. So let's remember, 3 times x minus 4 squared plus 1. And we did this already. So we don't have to keep, if we know what this is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. All right, now here's what we're going to do next. We're going to solve for my x minus 4 squared because we're going to use the square root formula. So let's write this all down. Okay, good. 3 times x minus 4 squared plus 1 is 0. So we're going to subtract 1 from both sides, and you get 3 times x minus 4 squared is negative 1. Divide both sides now by 3. X minus 4 squared is negative 1/3. I get x minus 4 is plus or minus the square root of negative 1/3. Now let's see. We're going to have to simplify this. Okay. Now remember what this is. This is going to be, let's do the work. Square root of negative 1 over the square root of 3, which is I over the square root of 3, times the square root of 3 over the square root of 3. We end up with the square root of 3I over 3. That's going to be our radical. x minus 4 is plus or minus the square root of 3I over 3. You're going to add 4 to both sides. Here's what we end up with x. X is 4 plus or minus the square root of 3I over 3. And we're done. This is complex. These are complex numbers. You have non-real solutions. And that was number, let's go back. Looks like that was number 39. And if we look at now number 41, we have negative x squared plus 2x plus 2 is 0. And let's see if we've actually completed the square with this one already. We did. See number 17. So I'm going to write that here. See number 17. So we're going to have to go all the way back to find number 17. And I may be able to do that a lot easier than you guys here because because I can. And if you go back to C number 17, you have y equals negative x plus 1 squared plus 3. So you can scroll back and see number 17. That's what we have here. But for this case, it's not equal to y. It's equal now to 0. So we're going to solve this by using the square root formula. Okay? So now let's solve this. Subtract 3 from both sides. We get negative x plus 1 squared is negative 3. Divide both sides by negative 1. And you end up with x plus 1 squared is positive 3. Apply the square root formula. X plus 1 without the square is plus or minus square root of 3. We're almost done. Just subtract 1 from both sides. X is negative 1 plus or minus square root of 3. Here's my irrational solutions, or my real value solutions. Solution set, negative 1 plus the square root of 3. Negative 1 minus the square root of 3. And you're done. That is number 41, I think. Let's double check. Yeah, let's do 43. And 43 is negative x squared minus 6x minus 5 is 0. Now, this number 43, C number 19. So I'll say C19. We've completed the square here. So 19, I can go back on my computer. And number 19, we ended up with, what's our final answer for 19? Looks like negative x plus 3 squared plus my 4. I just replaced this y here with 0. Negative x plus 3 squared plus 4 is 0. And I can solve this equation now. Subtract 4 from both sides. And we get negative x plus 3 squared is negative 4. Divide both sides by negative 1. And we get x plus 3 squared is positive 4. Okay. Use the square root formula. X plus 3 plus or minus the square root of 4. The square root of 4 we know is the value 2. So we get x plus 3 is plus or minus 2. Subtract 3. X is negative 3 plus or minus 2. Now remember what that meant. That meant two things. Negative 3 plus 2, negative 3 minus 2. X is negative 1. X is negative 5. Let's write that a bit better. Solution set, negative 1 comma negative 5. Let's get this here. Here are my solutions. And that's going to be what we have for problem number, oh, which one is that? It's 43. It leaves us 245. And 45 is negative 2x squared minus 4x plus 2 is 0. And if memory serves, C number 21. We already completed the square here. So it looks like we got y equals negative 2 x plus 1 squared plus 4 in this case. We're replacing y now here with 0 because that's what it is. We get this equation that we can solve. Subtract 4, negative 2 x plus 1 squared is negative 4. Divide both sides by negative 2. X plus 1 squared is positive 2. Square root formula. X plus 1 will be plus or minus square root of 2. Subtract 1, and you get x is negative 1 plus or minus square root of 2. Let's write that a bit better. Solution set looks like this. Negative 1 plus the square root of 2, negative 1 minus the square root of 2. And that leaves us up to 47. Negative 3x squared minus 16x plus 3 is 0. And I'm willing to bet, yep, that's 23. But if I remember, there was a typo. Yeah, there's a typo here. And I'll say again, C number 23. And in number 23, the solution came out to be, let's see. Y is negative 3 x plus 2 squared plus 6. And again, replacing y with 0. So negative 3 x plus 2 squared plus 6 is 0. You subtract 6 from both sides. Negative 3 x plus 2 squared is negative 6. Divide both sides by negative 3. X plus 2 squared is positive 2. X plus 2 will be plus or minus square root of 2. Subtract 2 from both sides. So x will be negative 2 plus or minus square root of 2. Here's my solution. We'll write it this way. Negative 2 plus the square root of 2. Negative 2 minus the square root of 2. And we are done. This is how we solve equations by completing the square.